This episode of the Ecommerce Playbook podcast is brought to you by Sorall. Build your influencer marketing program on autopilot with a simple workflow for everything from gifting to paid campaigns. Try it out for free at getsorall.com/champions/CTC or with the link in the show notes. Hey folks, welcome to the E-commerce Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Richard Gaffin, Director of Digital Product Strategy here at Common Thread Collective. And normally at this point, I would say I'm joined as always by Taylor Holiday, but Taylor is in fact on vacation this week, a much deserved break. And instead, I'm joined by former E-commerce Playbook podcast host, Andrew Faris, now of, what's the name of your gig right now, Andrew? AJF Consulting, something like that?
I appreciate the serious prep effort you went to make sure to get your guest right. That's really good. No, AJFgrowth.com is where everything is.
There
AJF
we go.
Growth.
Yeah, AJF Growth.
Yeah.
I knew that.
I'm totally joking. It's fine.
Well, I literally had it pulled up on the screen, but for some reason my brain just didn't make the connection. But anyway, yeah, Andrew's joining us again. We're going to talk particularly about some of his work in growing businesses from 1 to 20 million and all of the secrets involved there. But yeah, Andrew, maybe give the folks a little update on where you're at, what you're doing, and what your work entails.
Yeah, well, mostly I'm pretty sunburned. It's July 5th when we're recording this. That's probably the biggest update. I was thinking actually it would be like July 5th has to be like the aloe vera Black Friday for like a retail stores, right? It's got to be like the day where you sell all the massively disproportionate amounts of aloe vera because I'm pretty sunburned. Other than that, what I'm doing besides tending to that is I'm growing e-commerce brands with AJF Growth. So about a year and a half ago, I left 4x400 and wasn't sure what I was going to do. Ended up starting the consultancy of my own. Kind of had a couple clients fall into my lap, and suddenly I was a consultant and freelancer. It's been a great fit for me and I love it. And so I've been chronicling some of that and some of my thoughts separately after this podcast, which is funny, by the way. When you said the e-commerce playbook podcast, my immediate reaction was to be like, oh, got to re-record that. It's not called that anymore. Because I have had to get used to not calling my podcast that anymore because now it's the Andrew Faris podcast, separate from this. But no, this is the e-commerce playbook podcast and I'm back. But yeah, I've been growing. I've been working with e-commerce brands, and really the thing that's been interesting is I've been sort of landing on, when you start your thing in a consultancy, I think there's like a temptation to take on lots of different kinds of stuff, and not even just like take on any work that comes to you. That wasn't so much it as it was just going like, oh yeah, I could do that. I think this would be good. And what I've landed on is like there's a kind of client and a kind of part of the e-commerce journey that I love the most. And this is tied a little bit to the 4x400 journey and a lot of things I got wrong and right in that journey. And just at a lot of my clients at CTC when I was there, which is what I've come to realize. Like I love growing e-commerce brands, working with like entrepreneurs. So like my favorite clients are the client who started the business themselves. The director of marketing at or the director of e-commerce at a bigger business is probably really smart and fun to work with in their own way. But that's not my favorite kind of client to work with. My favorite kind of client is I like going straight to the entrepreneur who's taking the risk, taking the leap, building their own business, and has gotten past the earliest stages. So we're not talking about like I've got $100,000 in revenue and maybe I have a thing here. That's a little too early stage for where I like to be right now. My favorite is like between probably 1 to 5 million, showing real signs of life and wants to get to like 20 plus. That stage of the journey is super fun to me. And then making meta ads the primary. So I end up doing like a lot of coaching in that stage because there's a lot of that growth journey that requires like understanding some of the financial elements of growing your business along those ways. It just changes so much from the way you manage a business that's sort of right around 7 figures to low mid 8 figures. So a lot changes in that journey, and so I like coaching that side of things, and then making my main execution tool meta ads for that. So there's lots of other things you need to do that, but the thing I like to work with where I'm actually getting my hands dirty in the business besides just coaching and helping with forecasting and stuff like that is actually in the execution and creative on meta. So that's what I've landed on. That's what I'm doing right now, and I've got a few clients that are kind of right there, and it's really fun.
Okay, so maybe you've already answered this, but what is it about? So beyond simply like the client being different, what is it like in terms of the actual day-to-day execution of that growth period from 1 to 5, from 5 to 20, whatever, that you find so exciting or enjoyable?
I think it's that you can take giant bites fast. You see huge impact. Suddenly, new ads hit and you double your revenue. It's just, whereas like once their business gets to a certain point, I was working with one business for a little while that was already at like 30 million before I started with them.
Mhm.
And I think I did good work for them and it probably helped them grow 5%, and that's great. 5% is a lot at $30 million. So it's $1.5 million. It's really good. And maybe it even got up to 10%, and that's awesome. But it's a lot harder to feel it, and it's a lot harder to have the energy around it as that. And then I also just love teaching, and I find that in that stage of I just think it's so fun to take a concept, pass it off to somebody else, and watch and see them internalize it and get it and do it. So a lot of my content is basically me trying to do that as much as possible with people. And I suppose it's content marketing for my business, and I suppose I make some ad dollars and some stuff like that. But the truth is, it's actually not the best return on my time. I just love doing it. So yeah, when you're kind of deep in a business with an entrepreneur and you're alongside them, and you're sort of their most senior person they have on their team a lot of times in terms of experience, it's really fun to go like, hey, have you set up your cash flow forecast? Do you have a really strong cohort model P&L? So that you know how to think about how this business is going to grow. And that way, when we run these ads, we know, and you have a constraint around your OpEx. And that way we know you're going to generate profit at the end of this. And a lot of these things that are like really important that you and Taylor, I think, talk about a lot, that I just love seeing that because, I'll sometimes have a conversation. Like I have one client right now who said, like, I don't know how I did this before I had these documents in hand and was doing these
Yeah.
things, and yeah, the answer is like you did a great job and it was a really hard work, but like you just need somebody to kind of show you those things. I think it's fun.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, totally.
I also just love direct response advertising. So meta ads is fun for that.
Yeah, well, it's definitely like I think in my experience too, it's the stage of growth right before the business grows to the extent that now they're sort of like policing their own sort of like brand voice and being a little bit more like white glove about like what they try and they don't try. But I feel like 1 to 5, 1 to 20, you're in a situation where you know that there's an opportunity to win because something is definitely working about this business, but I think there's also like more openness to doing kind of whatever you want to do to make it work. Which is
Yep.
definitely like
Yep.
that's how like when I started CTC 5 years ago and we were on the same team, like that's kind of what the attitude was. Like we'll try anything, see if it works, test whatever, all that kind of stuff. And it's like that perfect like point where testing stuff may actually work, may actually do something huge, but yeah, you're also not at a point yet where people are afraid they'll get fired if they take too big of a swing,
Yeah.
which is
That's
nice.
right. Yeah.
But okay,
Yeah.
so speaking of that, this growth phase, 1 million to 20 million, we're saying, but let's say 1 to 5. Already alluded a little bit to some of the kind of key things about making that work, but let's talk about. So if the premise of this podcast, let's say, or this episode is secrets for growing from 1 million to 20 million, let's get into some of those. What do you think are the
I love that.
most important
Content marketer.
Yeah, that's right.
Content marketer clickbait right there. That's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, what would you say is the most important thing? If you could boil it down to one sort of summary secret to that growth stage, what would it be?
You have to build your whole. This is going to be. I'm going to cheat. It's going to be two
go
things. But it's together. I think you have to build a model for how contribution margin is generated in excess of your fixed costs, and then you have to have a way to execute that. And there are actually multiple ways to do those. To do the second part of it, the first part of it, I'm not sure there are that many ways to do it. You have to have a clear framework for how you are going to generate. You need to know as clearly as possible how you're going to generate contribution margin in excess of your fixed costs. And you need to, and what I mean by that is you need to understand where the relationship between customers and orders in your business, customers and products in your business, the relationship between those two things generates dollars in excess of the variable costs associated with that, and then the fixed costs that are required to get you there. You need to know exactly how those things work together, and then build your plan and your playbook around actually executing that knowledge set, basically. That to me is the game. And if you don't do that well, there are just a bajillion landmines along the way that you just don't see coming. And they can come in a lot of different places. You have to understand that almost every other problem can be solved. Let's take cash. Cash is a big challenge for growing e-commerce brands, but it can really be solved pretty, I won't say easily, but it is very solvable. It's not a problem you can't overcome if you are really clear and you are tracking carefully how contribution margin is coming in excess of your fixed costs. And so to me, like that, getting that right, and then like I said, having sort of one clear mechanism for doing that can work. So the mechanism for doing that can be all kinds of things. Like I interviewed Isaac Medeiros on my podcast, who did $10 million in revenue without a single dollar in ad spend by just crushing organic. It's the most popular episode of my podcast I've done. He just crushed organic content. He's incredibly good at it, and he built this entire system built around that with all of the time and money and thoughtfulness that I would put into ads. And he's got all of these things. So maybe, I don't know, I'll send you that if people are interested in hearing how he did that. Most people shouldn't try and do what he's doing, but it's one way to do it. Some people should, but most people shouldn't. And I'll send you the link for that, Richard. You can put it in the show notes. But that would be one way to do it, right? You could actually be an incredible search marketer or a great SEO person. Like I've seen businesses that work this way. Killer, insanely long funnels that like start with a click from a paid click, but actually are as much as anything else about like these deep, detailed upsell, downsell, email, like all that kind of stuff. There's sort of an older school e-commerce marketer who does all those things. There's definitely ways to do it that are beyond that. Meta is going to be the most common for sure, but there are ways to do it. But in all of those plans, no matter which one you do, you have to have some model for how you're going to generate contribution margin and excess to your cost. And it sounds so obvious, man, but like people I don't think about the fundamental problem with their business that way. They think about all kinds of other things. It's really hard to look through the giant mess of spreadsheets and data and Shopify dashboards and all the things that are thrown at you. And like, high volumes of advice from e-commerce fuel and Workspace 6 and Foxwell founders and Admission. And Admission is actually probably an exception to this because you have a clear framework.
Oh, thanks.
But like all of these things, no, seriously. I mean, it's one of the reasons people should go do Admission is that there's, instead of it just being a lot of different people chiming in with things that work for them, it's an actual framework for how to do it, which is a gift when you're in that stage of business. So, and Twitter, all these things are all shouting at you, do this, do that, run Post-it note ads, run like, whatever. Like there's just like a million different things out there. Trust the algorithm, don't trust the algorithm, like all that stuff. Right. But like, gosh, if you can siphon through that noise or sift through that noise with some idea of how you're going to generate contribution margin in excess of your costs, you can solve a lot of problems for yourself.
Okay. So you've sort of, touched on, I think, the answer to this question, but like what are, maybe for our listeners out there, what are signs, what are potential red flags, or that you should sort of become aware of in yourself that you're in that space where you're following things that won't necessarily take you to where you want to go? So obviously you talked a little bit about if there's a lot of noise, maybe focus on specific tactics rather than an overall strategy or whatever. But what else are like characteristic? Because again, this goes back to that question of like, so obviously for me, because I host this podcast and work at CTC, it seems very obvious or whatever. But of course, I'm not in the weeds. So for somebody who is in the weeds, what's a sign that you're focusing on the wrong things and that you need to shift focus to something else?
I actually think the sign is, do you have a clear framework, including a clear forecast of, and I think like it's this simple, like the value that you're going to produce over time. And I would say if that forecast isn't built off of an LTV model and you're running a D2C brand, then your forecast isn't good enough. It's like, this is an overwhelming piece of advice for a lot of people. It really is. But it's like, challenge yourself to take the 4 hours it's going to take you to build this and just set aside the time, get the help you need, join Admission, get help from somebody there, like whatever you got to do to build a cohort model forecast for your business. And then stare in the face the number that comes out at the end of your cost of goods and your CAC and then your operating expenses. And do you have a positive number after those things at some point in your growth curve? It may not be today. You may be fronting some cash to get your business going. I get that. But do you have some clear model for that? If you don't, that is the sign that you aren't there yet. So another like sort of, that's the thing. That's what I'll say is like, if you have that in place, a lot of other things, it will help you bubble to the surface where the problems are in the business. Because, for example, if your customers are not worth very much to you, if you don't have very much LTV over a long period of time, you will quickly figure that out because you will project out future value of those customers in that cohort model forecast, and the number won't be very big in revenue, and you'll suddenly go, wait a minute, those customers aren't generating much money long term, so what do I do? And then if your ads are not also expected to make a lot of money for you, or your organic content or whatever isn't expected to make a lot of money for you on new customers in that same thing, suddenly you're going to look at a cohort model forecast and go like, this number doesn't get very big. And it will actually direct your attention towards the problems in your business, maybe even to one that says like you should stop. Like, I don't know, like it could be. It's actually probably not that, but it could be that. So yeah, I ran at different times at 4x400, we had up to 5 brands in our portfolio. One of those is still going, Bamboo Earth, and that's the most successful of them. I did not have this in place at the time. We were, I would say CTC, Taylor, especially, was really developing a lot of the details that have kind of come up and I would say have been codified in the growth quotient. What's that tool called, Richard? The
e-commerce diagnostic toolkit. That's right.
Yeah, right. So that's exactly the kind of framework I'm thinking about here, and that will show up in a cohort model forecast. And we didn't have that for 400, but it's interesting when you play that back. Like we had one brand exit around, mid 7 figures. We have one that's still going and is into the 8 figures. We had one exit low 7 figures, and then we had a couple that sort of were DOA and never really made it even to 7 figures, I don't think. And when I play back the different routes of all of those businesses through the framework of what I just said about a cohort model forecast, if I would have cohort model forecasted those things out at the time with the information I have now, I would have been able to tell you exactly which one was going to be which, probably in advance, and which ones were worth the time and which ones weren't. I just didn't see that clearly at the time and cost a bunch of money in the process. And so, man, if I could take that back, I wouldn't have even acquired some of them, honestly.
Yeah, interesting.
If that was the case. So yeah, it would make all the difference in the work.
Yeah. Okay. So let's break that down a little bit. So you mentioned, of course, the e-commerce diagnostic toolkit, and at least some of the framework work, let's say, that we do on the CTC side in terms of thinking about the growth potential of a business. So maybe let's break down a little bit some specifics of maybe of the 10 metrics or whatever within the diagnostic toolkit, of which ones that you find, at least at this stage, what's most important to look at? What do you find yourself looking at the most? And maybe even which one of these do you wish you could have seen when you were the CEO of 4x400?
I tend to boil it down a little simpler than the growth quotient does, and then the e-commerce diagnostic toolkit does. Though I probably should use the toolkit because there's a couple things here that would be very helpful. But there are a couple things. Taylor the other day tweeted something like, if you could start a brand with, and you had 2 out of these 6 or 7 elements of the brand. You had, celebrity co-founder, a bunch of organic revenue, or a bunch of organic traffic. Like I forget what the other ones were. Negative cash conversion cycle. Which ones would you pick? And the last 2 were gross margin in excess of 90% and LTV in 1 year in excess of 150%. And those are the 2 that I picked. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. It doesn't matter why I ultimately picked those, but those are 2 things that I would say I look at for every brand. Every brand that I look at right now, especially if I'm going to work with them. And, for me, I get paid on a percentage of ad spend, at least to up to an extent when I work with a client. I need to believe they have some ability to scale. And I think that the brand cannot scale. Essentially, that 20 million is possible somewhere in there. If that's possible, then I could probably work with them. I just think if you don't have one, and ideally both of those, but even just one of those 2 things, you are in pretty bad shape because you need to either be able to acquire customers and generate a pretty good amount of profit on acquisition, which would be the low cost of goods. Also, low cost of goods as sort of the hidden advantage there is low cost of inventory on hand as well. Yeah. So on a cash basis, it makes your life a lot easier. And then high LTV, the thing that people I think don't realize a lot of times is that generally speaking, and anything in this format is going to have to be a generality. So there's going to be exceptions to this. But generally speaking, CAC correlates not to LTV, but to AOV. That is, it's the cost of acquiring a customer has a lot less to do with their value over the long term and a lot more to do with the value on the first purchase as a general rule. And that means that if there's an extremely high LTV customer, then you can typically acquire that customer for a pretty similar return on ad spend as you could if they were pretty low LTV. And what that means, there's this huge advantage in their massive LTV. And it also checks a box that you kind of have to have in an e-commerce business, which is some organic revenue. Now, and that's in the diagnostic toolkit as well, some organic revenue. But when people think of organic revenue, what they usually are thinking of is new customer revenue. Like, for example, you have a bunch of SEO or like great word of mouth or something like that. And those are great. If you have those, awesome. But returning customer revenue as your source of organic revenue works. It works really well. In fact, can even make it so that like then paid media, which is part of why I picked those 2, is that that's one of my strongest areas. So I feel like I'm able to grow the business on Meta if I know I have high margin and high LTV. If I have those 2 things, so I can acquire a bunch of customers at some contribution margin on first purchase and I also get some LTV out of them, and it's a good amount of LTV, 150% plus. Like we know for a fact. You've got the standard here, and the diagnostic toolkit is 100%. If you get 100% growth over the course of a year, so if I spend $1 today, I'm worth $2 to you by the end of the year. That's like that is a great benchmark. And if I'm at 150%, I'm in really good shape. So that's the starting place for me. And when I'm working with clients, one of the first things I'm doing is working on like the target for them and saying, what is your paid media target? Well, it's dependent on those two things. What's your actual COGS and what's your actual TV? If we can start there, then suddenly what you see when you do that exercise is that if you have low COGS and high LTV, you can pay a lot of money for a customer and have them still be very valuable to you. And I think it's helpful to think about this almost like in terms of return on invested capital. This isn't a perfect comp, but think about it sort of like if you put your money into an index fund, just like low cost S&P 500, and you expect whatever 8% a year or something like that on that. People vary that a little bit, but something like that, right? Well, how does that investment fare versus your investment in a product and customer in your business? And sometimes I'll sort of do that comparison. And with high margin and with high LTV, man, you can get like 100% return on your money or whatever, and be just having a whole lot of dollars come in. That ends up over time also solving the cash problem, which is nice because unless you're growing insanely fast, what happens is those returning customers are valuable to you over time. And suddenly they start producing a whole bunch of cash in your business that you aren't paying out the door in Facebook ads or whatever to get. So anyway, so those two things I think are the place I look. The third, there's one other thing here, which is OpEx low as a percentage of revenue. It's another thing that's in the diagnostic toolkit, I know, but I think it's so crucial. I'm now to a point where this is like one of the pillars of when I'm working with a brand. People need to internalize how important it is to keep this constrained because e-commerce businesses scale awesome in terms of OpEx. You just like, I told Taylor, like, the benchmark in the diagnostic toolkit is 25%. OpEx is 25% of revenue or lower. Then you're in good shape. That's fine. I think it should probably be 20% or lower. If you're pure play e-commerce, if you don't have any other channels, like just keeping that OpEx as low as a percentage of revenue is such a massive benefit of the business model. I think it's core to what makes e-commerce a good business, is that you can keep OpEx really low. It's the advantage of it, the same way that TV is like a core part of or let's say low COGS is a core part of the business model of SaaS, right? It's like it scales really well against costs against COGS. So in that same way, I would say D2C scales really well in terms of OpEx. So those, if I've got those three things, right, then I think I'm in very good shape with the business.
We talk a lot about good and bad UGC, but if you want a streamlined way to do the good kind of UGC, which is product seeding, then look no further than Sorrel. If you're still using a spreadsheet to save creator profiles for influencer management, you will love this Chrome extension that comes with Sorrel. You can see engagement rates, like projections, and their fair price without even leaving their profile. And you can add them to your creator CRM with one click. And that's just step one. You can search for influencers, send personalized outreach emails, manage your relationships, and track performance all in one place. Sound too good to be true? See for yourself with Sorrel's free trial. Just go to getsorrel.com/champions/CTC or click the link in the show notes. So what do you do if you don't have those three things? So let's say, I don't know, one of those three metrics is well below benchmark. You get a client. Where do you go first? Or what's maybe talk me through like what your problem solving sort of step by step is for figuring out what to do first. Let's say FOV to NCAC, because that's something that we see commonly. Like a lot of the clients or brands or whatever that come through that are in trouble aren't profitable on first order, and probably coincidentally don't really have the long-term LTV to float that. So that is, of course, its own thing. Those things are so connected. But let's say FOV to NCAC is sub-zero. What's your solve for that? What's your first move?
Okay, well, the first problem there to figure out, because so one of the things I'll say is like, this is an area where I disagree with some people, and maybe even I disagree with Taylor, is that like, I think there's a very good case that many brands should be acquiring customers at a loss as long as they have the LTV to support it. If you have 400%, 500% LTV, you are leaving tens of millions of dollars on the table if you're not acquiring customers at a loss, because the return on those customers is still so high. You just have to float the cash. But again, that's actually a solvable problem. It's not an easy problem, but it is solvable. And it's not an impossible problem either. So that's the first thing I'll say about that. The second thing is, though, I would just say, if I would first ask, is my problem there? a meta ads problem. It is possible that somebody's doing a bad enough job. I'm assuming meta ads is the primary acquisition lever.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible somebody's doing a bad enough job on meta ads that the reason that their FOV to CAC isn't good enough is because, or NCAC is good enough, is because they're just not thinking about their ads right. Like it could even be a target setting problem
Mm-hmm.
to where they've set their target too low and all they need to do is take a little less growth and take a little more margin on first purchase to make that customer worth a little bit more. That could be it. Sometimes people will ask the question like, well, what's a good ROAS? People say 2 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know. It depends. If your margin's not any good, if your margin's 40%, then 2 to 1's not good enough. You're losing money, and actually if your margin's 50% and you don't have that much LTV, you're probably still not in good shape there. So I'd first ask that question, like, are my targets set right? Or am I doing a good job in meta ads? Am I actually using the tool the best way I can use it? This is where I'd bring in concepts like bid caps or cost caps and think about my creative and all those kinds of things. It's also possible that I need to go back to the well with my vendor and figure out if I can get some more margin somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might be my vendor, it might be my 3PL. There could be a few different places where I'm looking to go save costs there. But I got I've got a client right now that's about to cut their margin on one of their core projects by or not cut their margin, cut their costs on one of their core products by almost more than 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a lot of work. They had to, I think we talked about this a long time ago, probably, but Supply, Patrick Cadou's brand, at the time, my first interaction with him was like him coming and saying, hey, like my ad performance isn't good enough. Richard, you worked with
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, I remember at the time. My meta ads aren't good enough. And I remember Taylor said to him, your meta ads are fine. Your problem is your margin. And he worked for like a year. He's been public about this, talking about like completely reworking the product basically to massively reduce his cost of goods. And suddenly he had a great business and then he had an exit and it like went great.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that I would say like, though that's the question is like, I don't know, is your margin actually good enough, but your CAC isn't? Well, then you might have a meta ads problem. If your margin isn't good enough and your CAC is pretty good, then you've probably got a margin problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's also possible that your business just is not well suited for D2C. And this is another thing I've come across. Like the example I think of here is Simple Modern, who I worked with for a while, now monster brand, but that brand was built on, they did over $100 million just on Amazon. And that is low margin, but that was built as an Amazon first distribution strategy, where they saw white space in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I did an interview with Brian Porter about this, who is the head chief e-commerce officer there, talking about how they did this. And it's sort of brilliant. He was thinking about the distribution channel of Amazon strategically in relation to that lower margin product, but massive total addressable market. Everybody needs a water bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs a cup. Everybody needs a lot of them, actually. And so he saw Amazon was a great shopping experience. They did some testing. It was a great shopping experience for that product. So even though it was lower margin, they could make money there because they weren't paying for the traffic on Meta or something like that. And then they've brought in Meta as a secondary channel with D2C as a secondary channel over time after establishing Amazon and Target and whatever else. So it just depends on a lot of different things and sort of how you're built. But that's the way I would think about that is maybe, if it's not a Meta problem, if it's not a margin problem, if you can't win on margin, or if you can't win on Meta and you can't win on margin, you might actually still have a decent business. You just might not be a decent D2C business, and you might need to think about a different distribution approach.
That makes sense. One theme that I feel like is coming out in a lot of what you're saying is this idea of entrepreneurs, particularly at this level, not being sufficiently cost conscious. And I think that that's something that we've kind of seen. We've talked about this several times over the course of the last few weeks and months of the idea that like we're moving from a sort of broader world state for e-commerce where like it used to be that money was free, whatever, capital was easy to come by. You grow, you don't worry about profit. And shifting away from that mindset seems to be sort of relatively difficult for people, or maybe just a difficult thing in general. But maybe give a couple like tips or hints or whatever, stories from the battlefield, so to speak, about like taking that OpEx number, taking your COGS number, whatever, reducing it, thinking about costs before you're thinking about other things.
Yeah. Let me think of examples of this. Well, one I just referenced, an entrepreneur who brought on a supply chain person to help him rework his supply chain and get, costs down really significantly on a core product. And that will actually launch in a couple of months. Actually, here's another good example of this. Actually, it's sort of the reverse. People don't think about this as a lever with the cost side of things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this answers your question exactly, Richard, but the other possibility here is actually to raise your price, and it's actually a much easier lever to pull in a lot of ways. And so I think that's a possible way to think about this. Is so actually that same entrepreneur also reworked his product to where, in fact, the cost will be similar, maybe even a little more expensive over time, but he can charge 2 to 3 times as much for the product, and therefore has a ton more margin on it, a ton, and can play with offers because of that, and all those things, and therefore is going to be in potentially a much better position from a finance perspective. So he's actually not really reducing cost per se, but as a percentage of revenue, he is, and that is just as effective theoretically. We'll see. It rolls out in a couple months, but I'm almost sure it will be, because he's got really thoughtful about it, and he actually did that. This is probably a good word here, which is like he did that in a way that was really thinking first and foremost about how to make the customer experience better. And so we worked on the product to make sure it was awesome, and now he's got a new version of the product that is more awesome, and that he can charge more for at the same time. And I think customers are going to be happy to pay more for it, because it's a great experience, and it's a good use of their legal tender in exchange for value. So that's the outcome there. I think that's it. OpEx one. I've seen another one recently, and I actually heard Taylor talk about this concept of sort of like lifestyle bloat. I think it tends to actually happen a little bit later than let's call it past 10 million. Here's what happens. You start getting to this thing where you're at or about to be at, or you're going to be at 10 million plus. And suddenly you start seeing all the things that were just fine when you were at 5 million and you were okay with it. And you're like, wait a minute, we got to do this and got to do that. So you bring on agencies all over the place to do all of these things and like quote unquote optimize them. And wouldn't it be great if we could convert 2%, 3% more traffic now that we're driving a lot more traffic? So you bring on a CRO agency and whatever, and your email flows, they've all got to suddenly be better. And it's like, well, actually, they don't have to be better. You're growing at a just fine pace without doing those things, and you'd be much better positioned, and you'd be much better off by here's the answer: forecasting your OpEx as part of your forecast, and then holding yourself to that. So when you do your core model forecast, if you get to that $12 million number or something like that, and you're on that pace, then the way to avoid e-commerce lifestyle bloat is to make sure that you have an OpEx number in there and hold yourself to it. And as long as you do that, and as long as you hit the other parts of your forecast, guess what? The profit number on the bottom is going to work. So there's other things too that happen, which is like you get a nicer office if you have in person, or like suddenly like you start eating better food or something like that. Whatever. And so I've watched at least one brand have to walk back, and this is like a really common part of the growth process. The same way that sort of like learning to cash flow forecast is part of the growth process for a $5 million brand. Learning to control your OpEx is part of the growth process for like a $10 to $30 million brand or something. And so it's a normal problem to have, but I think that's probably a way I would think about it. And this is where I also come back to like, man, so much of the work here. I got this idea from partly from CTC, who does a great job with this, with daily forecasting and daily, making sure that you've got like a daily number to hit. I actually like thinking about this on a weekly level better, but I have a client who actually was showing me that he was tracking he was acquiring customers at a loss because his LTV was so good. And his way of making sure that he didn't get himself into trouble with doing that is that he had a returning customer revenue number that he casted and tracks every single week. And he knows the moment that number turns the wrong way, as long as it stays the right way, he's in good shape. His forecast, that means his cohorts are coming through, they're as valuable as he wants. So I think that kind of approach to growing a business is really right. Like think about that metric and then do the same thing with your OpEx. Hey, is your OpEx number actually what it's supposed to be relative to these values? Great. Forecast it, track it. Maybe OpEx you don't have to do every week, but like every month, just go. Did it actually hit the number that we want? It's just easy for things to trickle. Suddenly Klaviyo wants twice as much as they did before. Well, all right. Well, do we need to switch to SendLane? I don't know. So it's like those are the kind of things that I think that you can do to keep an eye on that. But yeah, I think the OpEx thing happens a little bit later.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, in summary, a little bit, it's like there's a certain mindset at this phase where you've been winning, so you're trying to optimize at the margins or optimize incrementally rather than thinking about doubling down on the fundamentals or something like that.
100%. Yeah. The other thing people do is they start like, oh gosh, we've kind of tapped out meta ads, and so it's time to go over to TikTok, or it's time to whatever. And it's like, no. You probably, if you're not at $50 million in revenue, I bet you haven't taken meta ads as far as you can take it, and it's possible you could take it farther still. Don't diversify your ad spend too fast. That ends up being a cost center in your business. Don't do it. Instead, go think about like, how do you keep making that channel better and better and better? There's probably more to do. It's exactly what you just said. Like that fundamental is still there. Keep doing it. Keep going until you're really sure you've sort of squeezed it for all it's worth, and that you probably can't get more out of it. And I think 50 million is a pretty good number to hold yourself to.
Yeah,
it's a generalization.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it's part of the sort of mindset. I think there's a certain my or what I find rather is like people in the e-com space tend to be, and the business world in general, tend to be sort of allergic to the idea of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This idea that like you could always be doing more, you could always be like finding some opportunity here or there. And obviously what happens when in that mindset is that you forget about the thing that was working, and then the thing that wasn't broke does actually break. And so I think that
Yep.
there's like this is to go back to conversations we've had many times. David Ogilvy talks about if an advertisement is working, don't the tendency of the marketing department is going to be to try to fix it, to tweak it, to make it better somehow. But if an ad is working, of course, this is, in the time of magazines, so optimization wasn't quite the same thing. But if it's working, don't change it. If the messaging works, don't change it. If the Energizer Bunny is the mascot that everybody loves, don't change it from the Energizer Bunny. You don't have to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I find that definitely happens, I think, in terms of e-commerce growth on a more tactical level of like, yeah, we have to expand into Pinterest or whatever, but do you really have to do that? You don't.
Why?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But if you know those channels are worse, that's the whole reason you didn't use them before.
Mhm.
The whole reason you didn't use it is because it's a worse channel.
Yeah.
And this is why. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, you stay on those things and stay disciplined on those. And again, like I think this is where like having a forecast that you hold yourself to is just so helpful. Because the reason why that happens, Richard, is that somebody is out there talking about the win they had on it.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
Somebody made Pinterest crush for them.
Mhm.
Somebody did. I promise. There's somebody out there who's doing awesome. Someday, I'm going to make display ads work for an e-commerce business, and then I'm going to tell the whole world about it.
Yeah.
I'm going to just take a giant victory lap on it.
Mhm.
And when I do, you should not listen to me. You should shut me off,
Yeah.
and you should like just go like, nope, I don't care. I'm going to keep investing in Meta.
Yeah.
And
I was going to say that's like an interesting like cure for that thing that you were talking about earlier of just being like inundated with all of this noise about what the next interesting tactic is. If you have that fundamental down of like, this is what needs to work for us, this is what it looks like for us.
Yep.
And you're able to have some understanding of like, in this business, these things work, then you don't have to, you can sort of dismiss all of that. Because I was thinking about in terms of somebody winning on Pinterest, I think the tendency is like, I hear about this person winning on Pinterest, but this person actually has like a jewelry business or whatever that totally works on Pinterest.
Furniture. Yeah.
Your business is something else entirely. You're selling whatever, sea salt something, which, hey, maybe that would work on Pinterest too. I don't know.
Yeah.
But the idea is that like, just because something worked, like your business is unique, it might work for you. It doesn't mean it won't, but you have to take into account the sort of unique factors that make your business up, the specific goals that you're shooting for. And then you can make a call about what tactic you want to pursue,
And that comes back to people not knowing what they're trying to do a lot of times. This is another insidious problem, is that like you build a business and you're excited because your like goal is to quit your day job and have your business and you want to be an entrepreneur. And that's great.
Mhm.
You've achieved that goal. But now you have to actually create a new goal, because if you don't, what will happen is the only goal will be to make more money all the time. And every time you hit that goal, you will go, wait a minute, what if I made more money?
Yeah.
It's like the bar just raises. The moment your Shopify app hits the highest number it's ever hit before, you go like, okay, how do we beat it?
Mhm.
It's such a hamster wheel. And so the antidote to that is having a sense of what you're actually trying to do and try to get out of your business. I have one client who is certain that they want to build a 9-figure business, 9-figure valuation, and have an incredible exit.
Mhm.
Fantastic. If you're certain about that, I can try and serve that goal. I have another client who's certain that they do not want to build a 9-figure business because it will be too much management for them, and they want to, ski 100 days a year.
Mm.
And so it's like, okay, great. And those constraints then generate how you respond when major opportunities change or when you need to get more volume or whatever it is. Because like, well, I don't know, should I like push the gas pedal all the way down and try to acquire customers at a loss and squeeze out 30% return on invested capital over the course of a year at a big loss for 9 months or whatever, well, it depends. If you're trying to build a 9-figure business, maybe you need to do that.
Mhm.
And you need to be willing to take a bunch of risks, especially depending on the timeline that you're trying to do it on. If you're not trying to do that, then no, you shouldn't. You're just going to stress yourself out. You should take more margin sooner and have a bunch of cash. And sure, your business won't get as big. That's okay. So there's just trade-offs with all those things, and having clarity about what you're trying to accomplish is really helpful for thinking about how you approach those kinds of problems. That's much easier said than done. This comes down to, like I said, like one person's giant exit and another person's skiing 100 days a year are actually have nothing to do with business.
Mhm.
This is like down to like your human desires and what you think will satisfy you in life. So that's a very separate problem. It's very hard for me to answer for somebody. I probably can't.
Yeah.
I have an opinion, but I probably can't answer it for you. So yeah.
It'd be interesting to at some point do like, because I feel like you could break down like if your goal is X, the best business for you to be in is Y. I'd be kind of interested to do something like that. So for instance, I mean, you've seen a lot of different businesses. You've operated a lot of different kinds of businesses. If you are pursuing that 9-figure exit, what industry should you be in? Is there an answer to that?
Well, I don't know about industry, but here's what I will tell you. I actually told this person this client that. I told this person they actually had an offer for their business at one point, and it was a good offer relative to the value of the business. And so we were discussing, should they take it? And what they told me was, I want a much bigger exit than this. Do you think I can achieve it? And I said, my concern is that you don't have the LTV to achieve it. That it's going to be very hard to build a 9-figure e-commerce brand business without meaningful LTV. And so we talked about and evaluated and looked at that really, really closely, and ultimately decided that maybe we do have the LTV to achieve it. Because it's just, if a customer's not worth that much to you, it's possible you can be rich and you can be like the greatest, incredible advertisers in the history of the universe who are like, have this absolute 95th percentile, maybe 99th percentile elite digital marketing skill set, and build a big business without huge LTV. I mean, I'm assuming some things about their business right now. I haven't looked at it personally, but from what I've heard them talk about, and you could do it, but it's just really, really hard, and it requires some different things. And so I would say, like, if you want a 9-figure exit in e-commerce, then you have to have that, and you probably have to be thinking omni-channel. So you have to have a meaningful pathway into at least 3 revenue channels, probably, to get to 9 figures. It's gonna be pretty hard to do that just e-commerce. Now, again, you could be rich and do it. It's possible. It's not. We're talking about what's likely versus what's possible as 2 different things. So I would be thinking about, can you get one big box? Can you have a big Amazon business? Can you have D2C? And probably, can you have international somewhere in there? 3 out of the 4 of those is probably what you need to make it happen. And it's possible. It's totally possible, as long as you have a few other things there.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're almost at time here. Is there any last thoughts that you want to leave with your former audience and perhaps current audience here at the Ecommerce Playbook podcast?
I know that. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of crossover here. Last thoughts. I think if you are hearing this and you want you didn't ask me to say this. In fact, you told me I didn't have to say this. But if you are hearing this and you're in that stage of business and you want the beginning steps for this, there is a lot of noise and there's a lot of stuff telling you what to do at this stage of business. My personal strong recommendation is that you double up on Admission and the e-commerce diagnostic toolkit. You use those 2 tools as the place to start in that stage. So if you're 5 figures or less, not 5 figures, 5 million or less, and you're trying to figure out how to get to 20 plus, those 2 will be a serious guide to you, because you'll have some ongoing coaching support from absolute top tier sort of execution tools and Admission, plus a community and ongoing coaching in there, mixed with like a framework for how to do it. You do those 2 things, you're going to be in very, very good shape, and you're going to be guided really well. Try to shut out the rest of the noise. It's like, honestly, turn off my podcast. If you have those 2 things, those are the things that you're going to listen to. That would probably help you. So yeah.
All right. Well done.
I don't know. I mean, listen to me too, I guess.
No, definitely. I mean, I'll plug you in return. Please go listen to Andrew. He knows exactly what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But starting with the diagnostic toolkit, I think like part of the reason we built that was to give an easy way to build that framework and then to see where you stand relative to benchmarks that we believe to be. So maybe even an answer to my question about like, what kind of business do you need to be in to build a 9-figure business? It's like a business where you're hitting the benchmarks on those ones that you were pointing out, FOV to NCAC,
That's right.
LTV, 1 year LTV to NCAC, whatever. Basically, like what you can do with that tool is discover your growth potential, where you stand now and where you need to go, and what numbers you need to bring up. But cool. All right, Andrew, is there anything that you want to plug before we get out of here?
I do. I actually am not taking on like growth clients right now or anything like that. So I'm all full up there. So you can go get waitlist kind of things and all that and see what I'm working on at ajfgrowth.com. But the actual thing that I would love for you to check out is the Andrew Faris podcast. I have an episode coming up that is very relevant to this conversation, and that is it's the episode that I've worked the hardest and longest on of any episode of anything I've ever done, including on this show, the e-commerce podcast or playbook podcast. Sorry, TC. What it is it's called. It's going to be called Opening the Books, with a business that an awesome entrepreneur who is building a really cool business in this exact stage said, hey, yes, I will come on your podcast and show you exactly like the metrics and finances and all of these things in my business. And if you'll coach me for free, basically. And so that was the trade-off. I think I said it to her, but anyway, we basically made this exchange where she said, I'll show your listeners exactly what's happening in my business. And then if you'll just trade me some of your time to coach me for free at this stage, and maybe it will help them as well. So subscribe. It'll come out in the next month. It's not out quite yet, but subscribe to the Andrew Faris podcast on YouTube. Probably is the best place to do that, because that one's going to have a bunch of screen share. YouTube / @Andrew Faris podcast. It's going to be really cool. It's pretty long, but it's like we got into the details of this business and basically applied this exact thinking to a real business in real time. And I told her, here's what you should do at this stage in a cohort forecast and all those things that we just talked about. So if you want to see how this would play out with a business, not just us talking about it, but in an actual business, that will be really helpful to you.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. So check it out. Check out the Andrew Faris podcast. That's going to be valuable to you. That is exactly the type of episode that you should be listening to, the type of content that's super, super valuable just to see it in action, to see problem solving happening live right in front of you, I think is like super, super valuable. So go check it out. Check out Andrew. Andrew, thanks for joining us, and we'll see everybody next week.
My pleasure.
All righty. Take care, everyone.
Yep.